Hey everybody, welcome to the second Tuesday night of the month. I hope everyone is doing well tonight. Let us know in chat where you're coming in from, what you're going to be doing. This is Web Workers Online. We are a Memphis-based organization that has done local meetups for the past 6 years now. And obviously with COVID-19 and everything else, we've moved online. So that's what you are seeing here tonight is our third online meetup that I'm calling Web Workers Online as opposed to Memphis Web Workers, making it a little bit more national. Let me know if all the levels are going well tonight. We're going to have an excellent speaker here in a few minutes about some cool serverless function stuff. And I want to make sure that all of that goes as smoothly as possible. So definitely give a shout out when you're seeing anything go wrong, and I'll take care of it as quickly as possible. Other than that, I have a couple of small announcements. If you are a Memphis-based watcher tonight, know that I'm actually not going to be in Memphis too much longer. So I've been organizing this in Memphis for 6 years now. I've been a Memphian all my life, but my family is moving to Michigan, so we're going to be doing some awesome stuff up there. I'm going to continue doing Web Workers and Web Workers Online as long as I can while I'm up there. But just know that that change is coming. I'm still going to be in the MemTech Slack. I'm going to be doing a whole bunch of stuff to help the Memphis tech scene grow as I have for these past 6 years. But I'll be doing it remotely, doing it from up in Michigan as we go through that. So tonight we have an awesome speaker, which I closed my notes on. There we go. I actually don't need a whole lot of notes on him because he's been a friend of mine for, I don't know, like 4 years now, something like that. He is based here in Memphis. His name is James Q. Quick. You might have heard of him in one way or another. He is an Auth0 developer advocate. He does a lot of developer education, centered a lot around JavaScript, but around a lot of stuff other than that as well. He creates cool courses, and he's all around like a super friendly, helpful guy. So let's bring James over onto the stream. James, how's it going tonight, my friend?
Hey, hey. Oh wow, they caught like I think it caught me right as I was like turning my head to cough or something
I
because as soon
transitioned
as my face.
at like the
Yeah.
worst possible time. You're welcome.
It's all good, no worries. What's going on? It's kind of funny to think about like you having an intro for me
It's
because I like the same thing like I could give your intro and not really have to think very much about it either.
Yep,
So,
I literally put like 5 bullet points down like 5 minutes before we started. Like I just wanted to make sure I had that just in case I wanted to say anything. Did I leave anything out?
yeah.
Should I have mentioned something else?
Just overall badass, super cool. Like I
Damn
think
right.
you pretty much nailed it. We got all of it, I think.
Cool. So you're gonna be.
And by
Oh,
the
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, by the way, Brian, I was talking about your stream graphics and how good they look, and these are actually really, really cool too. So I like all of it put together is actually like really
the
dope. I'm really a big
the
fan of
first time I
those.
did it, I didn't have these like lower thirds down there to like identify people, and I think it's nice. It's got
Yeah,
like your Twitter handle on there, as long as I changed that from Gant Laborde a few weeks back.
yeah.
I also have our first Nancy appearance at the stream, so I gotta put a command in chat real fast. But we're
Nice.
talking about serverless functions tonight, right?
That is right. Yeah. So a little bit of background. Like I've spent a ton of time with serverless functions recently. I have a course that I've put out recently of combining React, not Creact, but React and serverless functions. And to me, they're super cool. I'll give some background in the talk about serverless functions and why you might end up going that route, and then tying it into like the idea of like protecting them, making sure that no one can do anything bad with them that you don't want them to.
Nice. And so one thing to mention is that James is everywhere. He's on YouTube. He's on Twitter. He's here on Twitch as well. I just put a link in chat. So be sure to check him out in all those different places. You're James Q Quick everywhere, right?
Everywhere, yeah.
So yeah, and as we go through tonight, if you have any questions, I'm going to stream them through chat. So put them in there. I'll be keeping an eye out for them, and I'll stop James if they're applicable, or we'll take them at the end. So whatever makes sense, just put them in chat. I'll keep a note of them. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, yeah, please do. That's the kind of stuff that I really enjoy when I stream and I give talks and stuff. So please ask questions if you have them. I'm trying out a new setup. Brian, I haven't talked to you about this, but I just bought an
Ooh.
iMac, and so now instead of having three screens where I would have my two monitors and my laptop, I've only got two,
Mm.
and one screen is going to be the presentation. The other screen is the like the show notes, so you can see what's coming next. So I'm going to try to kind of scroll in and out of the chat. But yeah, if you have questions, throw them in there. Brian's going to keep an eye out, and he'll stop me and get those through to me if I don't see them.
So James, I'm going to go ahead and transition us on over to your presentation, and it's going to be awesome. I can't wait.
Sweet. And I'm just kind of, it's weird because I've got the stream up as well, so I'm just kind of watching to see how this happens, and I want to take a glance at what it looks like. This is so badass. This looks great. I think you did a really good job with this. I'm going to restart my timer on the presentation stuff, and we'll go ahead and get started. One thing I do want to mention, this is the first time I'm giving this talk, so if you have feedback, like if you have questions, obviously ask them. If you have feedback, I would love to have that as well. I think that's one of the benefits we've both gotten through doing talks in the local meetup in person is we've got a pretty tight community, so people are pretty comfortable giving feedback and that kind of stuff. So if you have it, throw it in the chat, send me a message later on. If you don't want to do it publicly, that's totally fine, but first time, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. So, like I said, want to talk about serverless functions and then basically how to protect them. So starting out with just the basic information here, really, James Q Quick on anything. I've got the handle on here twice, social media, website is James Q Quick. Anything that you want to know, just go ahead and find me there. And see if this clicker is going to work. I consider myself to be three things. If you know me, you've probably heard this pitch before, but a developer, a speaker, and a teacher. And I've done some combination of those three things for about 7 years now professionally, which has been a blast. And full-time role-wise, I am a developer advocate at an amazing company called Auth0, where we focus on identity, authentication, and authorization. We'll talk about both of those pieces throughout this talk. If you have any questions about that, want to chat about Auth0, feel free, obviously, to ask about that as well. I also have kind of a unique ability to represent a couple of other companies in a really cool way. I am a Twilio champion. These are basically like Twilio advocates, so kind of not a full-time role, but kind of a side thing to advocate for Twilio and the amazing company they are and the cool technology that they have. And then also just recently joined Brian as a media developer expert, not for Cloudinary, but I think the wording or branding is that program is kind of sponsored by Cloudinary. So two companies that I am additionally excited to represent in addition to Auth0. So that's all I have in terms of introduction. I want to talk about this quote that I made up. This is completely just me, and it's the progression to protection. And it's the idea that I've been building a lot of demos recently, and I've had a ton of fun. I've explored with serverless functions, and I've realized that like to really build an application that is somewhat secure, you start to go down this path where it gets like exponentially more complicated. So this progression to protection is kind of like, I'm going to walk you through the steps and the considerations that you might have to think about when you go down that route of building a real world application kind of in the Jamstack. We'll touch on what the Jamstack is here, but really like this is what it looks like. You start off on this kind of like this slow kind of flat line, and then you just exponentially increase in terms of difficulty and the things that you need to consider. So that's what I want to try to address, and we'll kind of take this path together of walking through what that looks like. So the first thing is I'm going to kind of take on a persona of someone that says, you know, I want to build an app, right? And usually us as developers and people in general, we say, all right, I want to build an app. And I also want it to be as easy as possible, right? Developers, we go to Stack Overflow, we copy code because it's easy. That's just kind of what we do, and we're always looking for the next technology, the next framework, the next so-and-so that'll make our development process easier. So we're starting with, I want to build an app. And I can't tell you how many times over the years I've gotten this comment to say, oh, I've got this $1 million idea. Everybody has one. And how many times people have had that idea and never had the ability to build it themselves? Well, we as developers are actually really unique because we can take those ideas and actually build it out. We can build a product with all of the different technologies that we either know and are familiar with or can learn about and use. So it's kind of the difference here. And this is the approach or kind of the perspective we're going to take is you have an idea, you want to build an app, and then you get to your next question as a developer and you say, how do I build it? And then you also caveat it with, and also in the quickest and easiest way possible, that's what I want to accomplish, and then as easy as possible along the way. So my first piece of advice to people, if you want to build an app, go ahead and sketch it out. Like use pen and paper, pencil and paper on a whiteboard, on a wall, on a Post-it note, whatever you have, just sketch out what you think the app will look like, some different pages, maybe like how you go from one screen to another and how you kind of interact with the app and that kind of stuff. So you start with a sketch. And then as a web developer, we're here at a web development group, a web workers group. You go in and you start doing maybe some basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you take that sketch and you start to translate it into something that you can actually share, right? Like you can actually have a very simple quote unquote static site that you can share with people, and you can show and you can get people to like interact with dummy data and things just to see how it works, get feedback, kind of iterate from there. And so the next step of this is like, all right, I can run this thing maybe locally with my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the browser, but I really want to share this with like the world. I want other people across the world to be able to see it. And the next step, like the easiest, most attainable way to do that is with static site hosting. And what static site hosting is you have talked about this actually in a recent talk I've given, which is combining static sites and serverless functions a little bit. A lot of overlap here, but static site hosting is you have static assets like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and you take those things and you put them on some sort of static host. And when a user requests your website, the static host will just respond back with those assets immediately without having to do any sort of dynamic generation of HTML templates or going to a database or anything like that. Now, an interesting thing on here that I haven't really gotten as much pushback on as I thought I might when saying this in the past, but things like Angular, React, and Vue, I consider in this definition of static sites to be static sites. And the reason is with either of those frameworks, at the end of the day, whatever you build, you do a build process, and the output of that build process is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you go and just dump those files or set up continuous integration and get those files to a static host somewhere, and you're done. And so even though those sites are obviously very capable of being extremely dynamic, I still kind of consider them to be static sites. So if you have, I'd love to see your scandalous you're totally wrong comments in the chat if you have them, but that's kind of my definition of how I look at static sites. So yeah, that's super easy, and you start to look at options, and there's a lot of them, right? You could go to AWS, you could go to Azure, you could go to Vercel, which was Zeit about a month ago until they got a bunch of funding and rebranded. Firebase, which is awesome in a bunch of different ways, has static sites or static hosting as well. Azure actually announced their static site option recently, within the last couple of weeks, I think. So that might be one to check out as well. And then lastly, it's my favorite. This is Netlify. This is where I host all of my static sites. Almost all the demos that I do are hosted on Netlify. And the reason it is, it's so freaking easy. It just, honestly, it can't be beat. Not to say that these other hosts aren't great. This is my personal opinion of which one is the easiest for me. I love it. I use it for a ton of different stuff. So a couple of just bullet points here on static hosting. One, there's no server, or at least there's no server that I care about. So with a static site, again, you've got just static assets, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They live on a server somewhere, but I don't care about the server. I don't know about the server. I don't have to do anything for it. I just give the host those files, and I can do that in a really simple integration called continuous integration, where I can connect it to a GitHub repository, for example. And when I check in code to a master branch, it will automatically go ahead and basically deploy those assets as a site or as static assets in a Netlify site, for example. And that development process is just so easy. It can't be beat. It's like the best way to go for this kind of stuff. And then lastly, these things are super fast and super secure. The fast part is the fact that there's no dynamic real-time generation of files. They're just files that just get shipped down to the browser directly. The secure aspect of this is that there's no server. There's no PHP server like there was with WordPress. It's just files, and Netlify and these hosts can protect files, and they can just send it back. And so there's a lot less security risk involved here. And so this leads us into the idea of the Jamstack. And you can do a lot more research into what the Jamstack really means to you. It stands for, as you can see, JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And to me, it's really just it's using things that we're used to, right? JavaScript, APIs, markup, those are not new, but it's a new way of thinking about how we build sites and putting things together and getting kind of creative. And the main aspect of this is that we have no server or backend. So if we talk about static sites, which you see static sites in the Jamstack closely tied together, with a static site, you don't have to have a server or a backend necessarily, or at least not tied specifically to that site. Talk about some of those differences in a minute. And so like development experience, like your hosting and the continuous integration and stuff is really easy. You talk about performance, security, scalability. That all goes into the idea of like having a static site, and they're just files that you can replicate all across the world with a CDN, a content delivery network. And you get all of these benefits of the Jamstack with what I consider to be static sites. So like that's cool. We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're able to host it somewhere. We can let other people use it and try it out. But then the question becomes like, all right, where can I store and get or interact with data, right? There's not really many successful applications that don't have some sort of like permanent data behind it, right? And so the caveat again with this, with developers, is like, all right, where can I store and get and interact with data? And again, without me having to do very much work. So I'm not going to go and create my own database. I'm going to look for different data store options, and there's again a bunch. So something like Firebase is a favorite for people that are getting started. Airtable is one that I've used recently for several demos, which has been a lot of fun and like crazy simple to get started with. Something like Postgres could be used, a more like SQL or traditional SQL database that's structured data. There's a little bit more work involved than these other two, but certainly a viable option. Hopefully I don't have dogs barking here in a second. Something like Fauna. So Brian, you've done stuff recently with Fauna. Fauna is really growing a lot in terms of popularity in the community. Integration with GraphQL and being really made for the idea of serverless is really cool for Fauna. And then MongoDB, as an example, has really become kind of the traditional database that you see with Node, right? You hear about the mean stack, which includes Mongo, and it's almost like the default database for a tutorial that you see with Node. So those are some of the maybe more traditional things. You can actually get kind of creative with something like Trello to use that as a database. I got lots of comments on me using Trello as a database for a previous talk. So if you're interested in that, I can send you links to a previous talk and demo to show you how I did that. But basically, like any of these APIs can be a data store. People are using, now that Notion has an API, you can use Notion to store data and interact with data, which I think is wildly cool and kind of crazy. So in addition to like traditional data store options, there's also these headless CMS options which have popped up, which are gaining in popularity as well. The idea is like you have a place where you can interact and create data, a graphical interface, a user interface to do that. They take care of all the behind the scenes stuff, but that is completely separated from your front end, right? I can create my site in Gatsby or vanilla JavaScript or anything, and then just go and get that data from the headless CMS and display it how I want. So those are gaining a lot in popularity as well. I'm doing some really cool, or I think it's really cool stuff with Sanity that you'll probably see some content come out on my end in the future with that. So anyway, we've got kind of some database and data store options, however you want to call that. And then you start to think about like, okay, how can I add some functionality? And this is where it starts to get really interesting. And some of the basic examples are like, what if I wanted to send a text or an email? And if you notice at the beginning of this and you're familiar with a company like Twilio, these are things that Twilio can do both of these. And so Twilio is a cool company to add like really unique experiences. That's not the only example here. The main point is that like, all right, I want to add functionality to my app. The important part is that static assets or a static site doesn't mean, it actually doesn't mean at all a static experience. So we talked about like Angular, React, and Vue. In my interpretation of a static site, I interpret them as a static site, but those are obviously extremely dynamic frameworks where you can do anything that you need to. And that's really the same across the board now when we look at what static sites are. So you want to have these dynamic experiences. Part of that is being able to interact with data. And then part of that is just like working with different services that are out there to fill whatever gaps are that you need. And this is the beauty of kind of the world that we live in now, where we don't have to build the unique things that we might want to interact with or we might want to use. There's companies out there that are making their living off of building these things. Companies like Twilio to send emails and text messages. Companies like Cloudinary to host images and do image optimizations and transformations, something you'll probably see me talk a lot about in the future. Something like Shopify as an e-commerce platform if you want to sell things on your static site. Again, truly dynamic experience to allow people to buy stuff on your site. If you want to integrate with Twitter, I've actually got, again, some cool stuff combining Sanity and Twitter and scheduling tweets that you'll probably see some content come out about in the future. And then also an example of doing authentication. Like I don't need to know all of the details about authentication and authorization and all of the workflows and all of that specific stuff. Companies like Auth0 can take care of that stuff for you. So I'm going to take a quick pause. I'm going to take a drink, and I'm going to check in. I haven't looked over at the chat to see if there's any questions. And if you have any, I'll give you, okay. I'll take a break just because I'm moving fast anyway. And if you have questions or comments, throw them in the chat, and then we'll keep on going. Questions about Jamstack and serverless, all the questions. There's so many.
So with Sanity, you're doing some interesting things. Are we gonna get into like how you're securing that here in a minute, or is it a little bit more open with like a headless CMS?
So we will kind of, I'll draw the comparison to Sanity specifically here in a second, as we cover the thing I'm doing, which is pretty traditional to protect the Sanity stuff, is covered. The general concept. I will allude that to like Sanity specifically here in a second, if that makes sense. Sweet. Okay, I think we're good. If you have questions, again, as we go along, just feel free to throw them in the chat. So the next question is, all right, it's amazing that there are all of these different services, right? Like all these things have been created, and I want to interface with them. I want to actually work with them. And again, as a developer, I don't want to have to do very much to do that, right? The good thing is that's why these services are there, and their goal is quite literally to make that integration as easy as possible, right? Like if I'm an Auth0 advocate and people try out Auth0 and they have a terrible experience when they get started, they're not going to stick around and wait for that experience to get better. So all of these companies are really betting on and hoping to make your experience of interacting and interfacing with them as easy as possible. So what that looks like is you've got NPM packages for almost all of, and probably all of these, right? If it doesn't have an NPM package, you probably aren't using it, to be quite honest. But you have something like this where you create a new Trello object, right? So you install it, you require it, you configure it with an application key and a user token. And then after that, you've got something as simple as like a function that you can call to add a card to your list, something that I do. And again, the demo that I referenced before. And so there's the example with Trello. And then maybe with Cloudinary, you require Cloudinary, and then you call the Cloudinary uploader, and you call upload, and you upload an image to Cloudinary. And there's not really a whole lot you have to do there. And then maybe with Sanity, you require Sanity, and you create a Sanity client, and you give it a project ID and a data set and a token. And that's basically it. And that's like really, really cool, except for the fact that you're starting to see these things like API keys, secret keys, an app ID, an auth token. And you start to think like, I don't really know exactly what these things are, and quite honestly, what to do with them. And the important part of this is like some of these credentials are actually very private and unique, and you don't want those to be exposed to anyone else. Hands up for people that are in the chat, or just like comment in the chat if you've ever checked in like a secret key of some sort into your source code. And I think like I certainly have, and that's something that you don't want to do. So you've made this progress of like, I've got this static site, I want to interface with whatever data source, and I want to incorporate like Twilio to send emails or like whatever. And then you get to the point where like, all right, I know I want to do it, I know I can use this SDK, but how do I protect those credentials that should be private? And not all of them are. Like app IDs aren't necessarily private, but secret keys and things like that are, and you absolutely don't want anyone else to get access to them. So how do you protect your credentials? Because developers as a whole just absolutely love to hack stuff. And this is like, I've given a demo where I didn't have any protection around my demo, and someone, like, actually it was pretty cool, but someone hacked it like right in the middle of the talk. Like, I'm on stage in front of like 50 to 100 people, and he just hacked it right there. And it was cool, honestly, like an interaction, but it raises the fact that like people are looking to hack your stuff, if maybe for a productive reason for themselves, or maybe just because that's what they enjoy doing, or maybe they're just doing some penetration testing for you, which is kind of what the guy was doing for me. So the main point, one of the probably the most important messages in this talk, is that the browser is not safe, and also your source code is not safe. So what I mean is, those private credentials, your API secret and your auth token and stuff like that, those are things that you cannot have in the browser. Almost any code that you ship to the browser can be hacked. It can be like gotten, no matter how much minification you go through. Those things can be parsed out of that source code. And then also your source code in terms of like what's checked into your repository is not safe either. There's bots that go through and look at source code or look at repositories in GitHub, just looking for accidentally exposed secret credentials. And it's basically like we live in this world where there's all these ninjas that are just going around trying to find out what credentials they can take from you to mess up your app or whatever it is they're trying to do with it. And they're pretty sneaky and they really know what they're doing. And if you don't, it's easy to get caught up and have your stuff get hacked. So like kind of accepting that then puts you in this like kind of sad state of, I thought the whole reason of using these APIs and these services was that they did the hard stuff for me. Sad face, because you start to realize that like, even though they've taken care of so much for you, there's still a whole nother layer of things that you have to do to protect yourself. And so we've kind of gone through this progression of, we started from an idea. We built an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript site just for testing. We deployed it to a static host. We looked at integrating with different services and databases. We realized we can't really call those things from the front end because we can't protect those credentials. So you've really gone down this like winding path to all of a sudden get to, all right, maybe I need a server, but in the Jamstack, if you can get away without having a server, even better. And so maybe you start to think, I'll look into serverless functions, because I've heard that they are the new hotness and they're really easy to work with. And I can tell you, serverless functions are like crazy super cool. It's something that I spend a lot of my time right now with. I'm really passionate about, and they are a lot of fun. So why serverless? Serverless isn't actually quite true. It's a misnomer. There is a server. The fact is that like as a developer, I don't have to care about it. So I don't have to worry about that stuff. Because of that, it's really easy to use. We talked about this earlier. I don't have to do any of the like extra stuff for the most part. I just write a function, like an actual one file with a function in it. That's my serverless function. It becomes really easy to host. Again, I don't have to worry about a server. I'm kind of like still living in this Jamstack space where I don't necessarily have a backend or a server. And just overall, they're like damn cool, to be perfectly honest. And so those are a couple of reasons you might look there, in addition to the fact that now, and this was my biggest reason for moving, well, out of curiosity, but then also this specific reason, is now, even though I don't know about the server as a developer behind the scenes, there actually is a server, which means that I can protect my private environment variables. So what this looks like is inside of Netlify, as an example, you can store your environment variables, whatever private things you want to keep away from everyone else. You can add them as key value pairs inside of Netlify. And then in your source code, you can reference those things. So I mentioned this demo I had that I've given in the talk on several times of using Trello as a database. And in this case, I'm initializing that Trello client by grabbing those environment variables from process.env, Trello application name and user token, and same thing for Twilio, for example. And so I solved that problem. I can have those credentials stored in the server, and I'm feeling really good. I feel like I've just like Fort Knoxed my application because I am protecting those variables. No one else can get to them. And I think I've won something, and that's really great. But all you've really done when you have a serverless function that then uses the credentials inside of it, if that's all you do, all you've done is create a proxy that someone else can, even though they don't have your credentials directly, all they have to do is call that API endpoint, whatever it is, and they could still do whatever it is they want, because if you have a CRUD endpoint for create, read, update, and delete, and it's got the variables inside of it in the serverless function, someone can just call that thing directly, and it's almost as if they have the keys themselves, even though technically they don't. So you've made this big jump, right? You've made this leap to serverless function. You've protected your environment variables, but there's still this big gap on actually being protected. So one of the things that I started to think myself was maybe cores can help. And like kind of my interpretation was like, oh, that's a thing, right? That people use. And I think it was kind of eye-opening to me, because like I'm a relatively experienced developer. And as of like 2 weeks ago, I really had this like, wow, I didn't know what the hell cores actually was. And my interpretation of what it was and what it did was totally off. It wasn't right at all. And the reason is that cores is actually a protection in the browser only. So I would have thought my interpretation was like on a server, you can specify depending on, or basically specify, I'm only wanting to accept requests from specific domains. And this is kind of true. You can kind of do that. So with cores on the server, when you implement it on the server, you can specify a list of domains that you can accept requests from. But the only way that that actually gets enforced is not, in fact, on the server. It's actually enforced in the browser. So in the browser, this is kind of the browser's way of protecting you from having stuff go to other domains and doing nefarious things. So what the browser will do is basically ask the server, like, hey, can I make a request to you? And the server could say yes or no. And then the browser decides whether or not, based on that response, to allow the request to come through. But again, it's only in the browser. So still, you're in this position where you're not stopping someone from going directly to Postman. This is kind of like the end of all things from a development perspective when you talk about security, is how do I prevent the user from going, or a developer from going straight to Postman and doing whatever they want? And a lot of the next conversations or questions people have is like, all right, what about authentication? And you're like, that'll do it, right? Like that'll stop them. So I want to give an example here of an app. This is actually the demo that I've been referring to from the previous talk that I've given several times. This is an app where I can list the talks that I've given, and people can click on one of these and go to the details and give like a rating of what they thought and get feedback. And you notice that there's a login button in the top right. So this is signifying to you that like a user is not logged in, but they can still see that information. That's great, right? That's what I want them to do. And then I added this login experience using Auth0. And so I'm able to log in. And after I logged in, now I can show this add talk button. And so the add talk will take me to an add talk route. And then me, myself, being the only one that can do this, because I'm the only user that is able to log in here, I can go and fill out this form and submit a talk to the server. It seems like we're getting really close. Like that makes sense if I can restrict how many people and who are able to authenticate to sign into this application. Right now, I know the person has to be authenticated to get to this page and to submit from here. But again, Postman is really the thing that we have to think about, is what's stopping someone from going directly to Postman and either guessing what your API endpoint is, or sniffing traffic, or whatever they need to do to figure it out. They can figure out that endpoint, and then they can submit whatever data they want. So no matter what we do on the front end security is not security. Now, this is probably like point number 2 that's most important in here. Everything that you do on the front end is basically a convenience. It's a user experience thing, showing and hiding tabs, showing and hiding forms, depending on whether or not a user logged in, is not security. It's just a convenience for the user so that they have awareness of what's going on and what they can do. All right, so we've tried like all these different things, and you get to the point where like maybe you've heard of a token, and you may not even have any idea what that is. So you're like, fine, all right, what about some sort of token? I don't know about tokens. Like, and also what the hell are tokens and how do you use them and how does it relate here? But I'm getting kind of desperate, right? I want to try something. I want to get there, but I don't necessarily know what. So maybe it's a token. And so a token, this is a slide from a teammate of mine, Sam Bago on Twitter, whose name is Sam Bella. And I forget where he told us one time where Sambago came from specifically, but I can't remember. But this is literally, I just took a screenshot of his slides, and this is basically the definition of a token is just a unique identifier representing something. That's obviously super, super vague, and it's not super helpful. But when you get into something like OAuth 2, it actually carries a lot of weight. So OAuth 2 is a specification that has lots of details that are very deep and very specific, and is not the focus of this conversation. But I do want to give you a high level, just kind of example of what OAuth 2 is. So OAuth 2 as a spec is geared towards delegated access. And the example that you'll hear people reference that I think is actually a really good example is back in the day, LinkedIn, when they were like having new people join their platform, they would ask you if you wanted to like invite people from your Google contacts to join LinkedIn as well. So basically, LinkedIn is trying to get people to like spread the message to say, hey, come join LinkedIn because that's where you want to be type thing. That makes sense. Like lots of applications do this, but at the time, the way LinkedIn accomplished this was asking you for your username and password for Google. Lots of people did that, and LinkedIn would take that username and password and it would log into Google via the APIs, however they did it. And they would do whatever they said they were going to do, which in this case was like send an email or send an invite or whatever it was they were going to do. That's what they did. But the important thing is, like with your email and password, they said they were going to do X, and they could do whatever the hell they want. They could have deleted your account. They could send an email to your boss and tell them to like, I can't say too bad of a word, but like forget you type thing, like whatever they wanted, they could have done. So you're putting like this really blind trust into LinkedIn that they're going to use your credentials in the right way. And then like, what if you change your credentials? Which honestly, if you gave them your credentials, you should have changed them. But then after you change them, now the workflow is totally messed up. So the goal for OAuth 2 is just for a user to be able to grant specific permissions to an application so that they can do something with an API. So the example here, going back to the LinkedIn example, is in LinkedIn, I would be redirected to a Google login page where I myself would log in with my Gmail credentials. And then some sort of magic happens, and this comes like with the specification of OAuth 2 that I'm not really getting into here today. But after that magic happens, you get what's called an access token. And then an access token can then be used for subsequent requests to Google to do certain things. And that access token contains the ability inherently inside of it, we'll talk about this more in a second, to do specific things, but not everything. And Google can determine based on that access token whether or not it has access to do the things that are trying to be done. So you've probably done this before, and you may not have even realized it, but you've gone through this OAuth 2 workflow where you've done something like this. You've opened some sort of application. It says, all right, you can log in with Facebook, and then it pops up or it redirects you to Facebook, and you log in, and it says, all right, this application, whatever that application is, would like to get maybe some information about you. In this case, it's public profile, your email address, and your likes. That's kind of, I don't know what they do specifically with the likes. That's kind of weird. But those are, it's very explicit what that application wants to be able to do. And you or me has to have already logged into Facebook and then accept that these are the things that I'm comfortable allowing this application to do. So if you didn't know, you've been through the OAuth 2 workflow when you did that. And so again, the output of this whole workflow, magic goes on behind the scenes. The output of this is what's called an access token. And this access token specifically allows applications access to an API. So in my case, the LinkedIn example, I go to LinkedIn, I log in with Google, I'm redirected back to LinkedIn, and then LinkedIn gets that access token. That application, LinkedIn, gets the access token that it can use subsequently to call and do things with the Google APIs. Since Google issued that access token, it knows how to interpret whether or not you have access to do the things that you're trying to do. So there's two different types of access tokens. There's what's called Opaque, and then there's JWT access tokens. We'll spend most of our time, almost all of it from now on, talking about JWT access tokens, which I guess is a little bit redundant considering JWT stands for JSON Web Token. But an Opaque token is a unique identifier. We talked about the idea of that before. And it's literally just a string, like maybe 24. I don't know how many characters it is, or I don't know if it has to be a specific amount, but it's just a random string. And basically what that does, it's a unique identifier for that points or represents other information. So if you think about like a key and a key value pair, it's a key that points to a value of whatever information needs to be stored. And so if I get an opaque access token and I pass it to an API, whatever the API is has no way of knowing whether or not the user with this opaque access token actually has permission to do X, Y, and Z. So what happens is whoever created the token, you need to go ask them, say, hey, here's the token I just got, and ask them to verify and validate based on that token, does the user have access to do X, Y, and Z? This is not optimal because every time someone makes a request to like my serverless function, for example, that means I have to then go and ask another service, which means another hop to a different service to ask whether or not that token is valid and whether or not the user can do that thing. The benefit of this is like, since that the provider of those access tokens, which could be Facebook, it could be Google, it could be Auth0, whoever provided that access token has the ability to like basically revoke tokens by just deleting them out of their database. So if I pass in a token to a serverless function and I go to validate that thing with whatever the service is, that service now can say like, nope, that's not a valid token, right? The other side of this is JWTs or JSON Web Tokens. Some people call them JOTs. I don't necessarily understand that, so I do JWTs. And the most important fact here, this is probably point number 3 of like most important, is that JWTs inherently are verifiable and validatable. Are both of those words? Maybe they are. Verifiable sounds right. Validatable sounds a little odd. And the reason is that there's this embedded information inside of a JWT. So maybe you're like, all right, so tell me more about these fancy, magical, honestly, JWTs, but then also start with like, what the hell are these JWTs? So here's my definition of what a JWT is. It's this long string, and like you look at that, and you've probably seen one of these before, and you're like, okay, I don't know what the hell that is. So let's start to break it down just a little bit, and maybe this helps a little bit where we gray out everything except for these 2 periods. And if those aren't obvious enough, here's some really bold arrows to point those out. And maybe what you start to see, or maybe not, but what you might start to see is that JWTs have 3 parts separated by 2 periods. So the first part that you can see here is part number 1, or in this case called the header. And inside of that, there is information. It's basically just like a JSON object here for header. And in this case, it's got 2 properties, an algorithm, which is HS256, and then a type, which in this case is a JWT. So this contains some information about your JWT, like the algorithm. It could also include like a reference to which public key was used in combination with a private key. This gets into like cryptography and stuff, but basically what kind of key was used to sign this thing, and just some general information. And then you go, all right, part 2, and this is the body or the payload, and you can have basically any kind of information that you want. One of the things that you probably care most about is the sub, which in this case is a unique identifier to the user. You might also have a name, a username, an email address. The IAT is an issued at timestamp in milliseconds. You could have any kind of, as I throw my clicker, you could have any sort of information in there that you want, honestly. So you could put whatever you want in the body. And in the end, this last part is a verify signature. And what happens is you take the base64 URL encoded version of the header, and you add on the base64 URL encoded version of the payload, and then you encode that thing, and now you've got this unique verification signature to verify whether or not this JWT is valid. Now this took, like, honestly, up until a couple of months ago, where this has kind of become my job to understand these things. It's taken me a long time to really understand how this black magic works, because somehow, even though people can go in and with a JWT, they can actually, let's go this way. They can go to jwt.io, which you should check out if you're working with JWTs. They could enter in an access token or a JWT, and JWT.io can go and just parse the information from the header and the payload. So you should know that like the information in the payload is not private, so you can't keep like private information in there. And anyone can like decode that token, but what they can't necessarily do is validate that that token is a valid token. And that comes from this verify signature at the bottom. And again, this is a tricky thing to understand, and it takes a while. I was always confused about, all right, if somebody can decode this thing, what in the world is preventing them from just creating their own? The reason is if you create your own, you have to have some sort of secret key. Again, going back to the idea of like servers and secret keys, there's a secret key of some sort that's used on the server that generates that access token. And then if you get into, like if you've done Linux and private and public keys and that kind of stuff, if that's a private key, there's then a public key that you can decode this thing with and verify that it is valid. If you change the payload and the header in any way along the way, if you try to hack and say, hey, I'm not John Doe, I'm James Quick, the verify signature will fail. And so that way you can verify whether or not the thing is a real JWT. Anyway, if you have questions on that, feel free to ask, and we'll talk about that more either later or offline. So the next question in here is like, all right, well, where do these magical tokens come from? So we have a decent understanding of where these tokens come from, of what they are, and a breakdown of what JWTs are, but where do they come from? And like, my response is like, I don't know. And more specifically, my response is like, I don't know and I don't care, according to the serverless function. So the important part about this is like when we go through this OAuth 2 workflow, you do whatever the workflow is, right? Like you redirect to Google and you do that authentication process to log in with Google. You grant the access, you get the access token back as an output of that, and then it gets sent to a serverless function. And where that access token came from, it could be Auth0, like Auth0 could generate this access token for you. It could be Google, it could be Facebook, it could be whoever. But regardless of who generated it, from a serverless functions perspective is I don't really care where it came from. I just care that JWTs can be verified, and I have the ability to verify that this JWT is legit and actually is what it says it is. This is maybe point number 4. I should probably like 1, 2, 3, 4 these like really important points and make them a lot bigger because these are super important. So all right, we're kind of like, all right, serverless function perspective, where do they come from? I don't care. But what I do care about is how do I parse and validate these JWTs? So the most important part is like, even though I don't necessarily care where these things come from, they have to be included in every API request. So every request that comes into a serverless function needs to have an access token, or I immediately know that they're not authorized to do the thing that they're trying to do, whatever it is. So you get an example like this on the front end. This is some JavaScript code in React, and I've got a function here where I'm going to add a like to an image. And I start off by like, this is front end stuff. You don't really have to care about it too much, but I get an access token. So the user has already gone through the process of like doing that login process to redirect, and there is an access token. First off, I'm just calling in the front end to just grab that access token. It's there in memory. I'm just calling to get it. And then I make a post request, for example, to my API endpoint, in this case, my serverless function. And if you host serverless functions in Netlify, you get this route that's .netlify/functions. And I want to make a post request to that like image endpoint. I want to pass in the data. And then more importantly, I want to pass in my token in the authorization header as a bearer token, which means the format is bearer space and then token. So all right, that thing, if people are attaching their access tokens to the requests, the next part is like, all right, now in the serverless function, I need to actually parse that thing from the authorization header. So it's not super fancy. You'd come in and do a little bit of JavaScript here where you grab the headers out of that incoming request. And from the headers, you grab the property of authorization. So you get the raw authorization header. If there's not one of those, you throw an error, right? There's no access token included. And then if you remember, the format of this is bearer space and then the actual token itself. And so what this looks like is you can call a split with a space on a string. And so in this case, what the split will return is an array of 2 parts. The first part is bearer, and the second part is the actual token. The second part being in indexing in arrays, index 1. So this is grabbing out of that raw authorization header. I want to grab the second part, the thing after the first space. So that should be the access token. And if there's no access token, throw an error. Otherwise, you at the very least know there is one. Now you don't know that it's valid. You know that there is an access token that's been included. And then you go in and validate that thing. And you can use a package like JSON Web Token, which is on NPM. It's one that I use in a lot of my stuff. And there's a code snippet here. This gets into some details that I'm not really covering about like signing keys and getting the public key associated with the private key that signed it. All that aside, basically what we want to do is you can call the decode function with jwt.decode, and you can pass it the token. You can get the information out of that token, remember the header and the payload. And then if you know the key that was used to sign that token, you can use both the incoming token and that signing key to then verify that JWT. With the JWT or JSON Web Token package, you call jwt.verify, you pass in the token, signing key, some options, and then it will throw an error if that thing isn't valid. So now we absolutely know not only was an access token included, we know it's also a valid token that we can respect and appreciate the stuff that's inside. So from here, you can take it one step further. And like now we know it's kind of like, I would say it's a valid user, but that's not quite true because it's really just a valid token. That valid token could come from any user. This is actually an important implication. The token could have come from anywhere. Again, like where it came from, I don't know. I just know it's here. So you could take it one step further to then check permissions. So embedded inside of that access token, if that token, and that will be the user property here, basically the body of the token gets parsed and that becomes the user object. If you grab the permissions property out of that user object, you can check whether or not, if permissions is an array, whether or not that permissions array includes a certain permission. So whatever endpoint you're looking at, if you're looking at a CRUD application for to-do app, which is what people go for, you can have permissions for to do create, to do read, to do update, to do delete. And like you get into this really long scaled list of permissions. But the important part is like with that access token that comes in, I can check. So going back to the example of like creating talks on that site that I had, not only am I doing authentication in the front end, I'm also getting an access token that gets sent to my serverless function. On the serverless function in my database, sorry, first off, in my database, I'm the only one who has the permission for adding a talk. So even though someone else might be able to log in to the application, that's perfectly fine, I don't care. The access token and the permissions embedded in the access token are what give me specifically and uniquely the ability to actually add a talk. So that's the majority of what kind of this landscape is. We talked about like starting from scratch, having an idea, including services, needing to protect credentials, not wanting to create your own server, looking at serverless functions, looking at authentication, looking at cores and authentication, and then getting to this point where like, all right, the core thing that we really care about is this token that I can then verify and validate and trust that the things inside of it make sense. So just a couple of points here on just token best practices. One, these tokens need to be stored securely, right? Because the idea, again, when I like shrug my shoulders of where did that token come from, that token does not necessarily mean that whatever the user is that the token represents doesn't mean that that token came from that user. And this is the idea that, or the example that people give, which I think is really good. If you walk around the street and you see a movie ticket or whatever city you live in for a basketball game or a sporting event or a concert, and you find a ticket on the ground, you take that ticket up to the box office or the people scanning the tickets, and they aren't checking to see who you are, they're checking to see if you have a valid ticket. It doesn't matter where you got it from. Now that you have the ticket, you are entitled to get into that game. And that's how access tokens work. They have information embedded in them that can be trusted, but you don't necessarily know that they came from the right place. You can't care about where they came from. You have to be abstracted and you have to trust the information that's in there. So that means on the front end or wherever else these tokens are generated, you want to make sure that those things are generated and then not given away and exposed for other people to use. Probably an obvious aspect of this, again, on the front end is like use HTTPS, or I guess front end and back end for your API endpoints, but use HTTPS to make sure that the information you send along the wire is encrypted. We talked about your keys. So like you have to have some sort of private key to sign a token, and then either that same key or a public private key combination to be able to validate that thing in the serverless function. Don't share those things. No one else can have them, or else you get rid of the fact, or else someone else could basically generate your tokens and make them look valid, but they didn't come from the right place. Again, we don't know where they came from. We just know they have to be valid for us to work with them. And another thing you can do is use token expiration. So you can set an expires time for a token to make sure, like with banking, this is especially important. Like if you've ever logged into a banking app and you sit there for 30 minutes and don't do anything, they pretty quickly log you out, right? They don't want people to be sitting around leave their computer open and someone come in and steal all their money, right? So they have pretty quick expiration times on those kind of interactions. And that's something that you can just kind of gauge for yourself. How important is it that these things expire quickly versus a convenient thing of a long time, however long that is. And this is just basically to kind of say, like, you don't want to be this example of like you've got this access token talking about like securely holding on to them, and like you've got it and then all of a sudden you lose it, and then it's there for the world to see, and they can do basically whatever they want to, and that's not the kind of position that you want to be in. You want to treat these access tokens with lots of care and lots of love to make sure that you are actually securely protecting your serverless functions. So we're like 5 minutes over the 45 that we talked about, Brian. So I think we're pretty good there. Honestly, I've talked a lot. I'm ready to get out of here, barring any questions. If you have want any resources on my site at jamesqquick.com, I've got a talks page. You can go to my talks page and see all the talks that I've given. And top of the list right now will be this talk, and you'll have links to the slides, and I think it has a link back to like this event and stuff like that. So you can go and grab that. And then lastly, I'm James Q Quick on everything, social media, Twitter, Instagram, GitHub, basically anything that you can think of. My website, actually, that should have been the generic website of James Q Quick instead of the Talks page. You can go to Talks and you can go to the Home tab to get to the root page. That's all I've got. I want to thank everyone for kind of hanging out. This is a cool experience to do virtual talk. I think it's a lot of fun. And anyway, yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I'll stick around if you have any questions.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you being here too, James. Thank you very much. We did have one slightly off topic question from JC, actually. He asked about, he missed the beginning of the presentation. He asked about sanity. I gave a very short answer in chat, but I thought maybe you could go a little bit deeper into what sanity is and how you use it.
Sure, yeah. So sanity is in the category of a headless CMS. And so usually when you talk about a headless CMS, you then go back and talk about what a CMS is. And traditionally, you think of something like WordPress, and WordPress has and is really optimized for like a user interface to create and interact with data. So it's the ability to basically let like non-developers come in and like edit and create and update data, and it's just a really nice experience. So in the Jamstack and kind of like modern strategies for building sites, people are really separating your back-end representation of the data and the ability to create data and interact with the data versus like how you actually display it. In WordPress, those two things are tightly coupled. You do both of them within the WordPress framework. Now, with headless CMSs, you've basically got a GUI to be able to create data, and then you can interact and display that data in any way that you want. So the example for my personal site is I use Gatsby on the front end and then Sanity as the headless CMS. And what my site does is it's a static site. So at build time, it will go and grab all the information for talks, for example, or blog posts or upcoming streams. And then Gatsby will decide how to display that stuff in the actual site. So it's just a separation here. It's really like, honestly, the headless CMS is just a database with a GUI on top of it to interact with it. It's not a whole lot more complicated than that, just in general.
Yeah, I think actually they don't always at Sanity refer to it as a headless CMS. Sometimes they talk about it like being a structured data platform. It's all about the data at that point. Cool.
Yep, and I should check my phrasing to make sure it aligns with them as well, because I'm a huge fan of Sanity, and I've spent a lot of time talking with them and really enjoy their group and community. So I'll make sure to kind of update my phrasing to match there.
And then, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm looking at the chat if that's what you're going to say. Okay. George says, what are you drinking? My wife has been drinking like the flavored seltzer water, and I guess I've come to like it okay because I do it enough. This is Waterloo Watermelon. It's a brand that she found and tried out. So yeah, that's what that is. And then George is saying not necessarily you can use WordPress as a content publishing system that gets consumed. Let's see, that gets consumed by a static site. Yeah, so WordPress more recently is now able to, I guess you could have done it before. WordPress traditionally, I'll say traditionally, and especially several years ago, was the combination of being able to display and create data. It was really parsed together. You can absolutely use WordPress in the same way that you can use a traditional headless CMS or a structured content thing like Sanity. um, they've got APIs and they've done plugins and things to be able to interact in the same way. So yeah, you can absolutely use WordPress the same exact way as basically any of the headless CMSs. So great clarification there. JC is saying, at what point in software development lifecycle should someone start implementing security like tokens? I think hopefully hopefully some of that made sense in this talk, or maybe not. And if not, let me know. But it's this progression, right? Like you don't necessarily need to start thinking about that. You need to take kind of baby steps and think like, all right, I need to get a sketch, right? I need to see what this thing hopefully is going to look like. Maybe I'll do like build out a prototype that I can share with people with static dummy data and HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you look into like, all right, how can I interact with data sources? And then you get to this point where you realize like I can't have API credentials or secret keys in the front end. So now I need a back end of some sort, which could be a serverless function. It could be an actual traditional server. So I think like it's just building up to that. It's like I wouldn't necessarily over engineer this from the start. Once you get to the point where you realize that like you have back end endpoints, whether or not they be serverless or just in a server of some sort, and you need to protect those, then you need to do it. And honestly, for the demos and things that I build, like I'm doing some of this protection, but it's really not necessarily, mainly just because no one cares at all to hack my site, probably. But if they did, I could get in a lot of trouble, and they could like send a bunch of requests and overload it or load my database full of data that I don't want, stuff like that. So even though right now with these demos and things, it's probably not that important, it certainly could happen.
I think you could also think about it in terms of like your quotas, right? Like you don't want to go over on all that
Yep.
stuff. It's not necessarily even like I'm worried about people posting to my site. It's like, what if they just like used all my build minutes or used all my
Yep. Yeah, you could absolutely, if someone knew my Netlify build hook, for example, they could just like do a loop running builds, right? And that would kill my quota. And then I wouldn't be able to build my site for the rest of the month. And that's if I didn't automatically go into a paid tier and get charged, right? So I'd be screwed that way too. And I think that, so a DOS, denial of service, that's one of those attacks where like if you have a quota and you get shut off after a quota, that's what people can try to do, is they can use up all of your quota, and then but you're screwed, right? Like you're shut down for the rest of that month or whatever that like billing cycle is. George added the link to the REST API for WordPress. They've also got a WP GraphQL, WordPress GraphQL layer. I forget who worked on that, but I've heard him talk on like podcasts and stuff about him building that out. And then I'm looking at the the picture that George sent of sparkling water and water and stuff. It's funny.
that is
People should open that up and check it
that
out. Yeah.
cartoon is 100% me. My wife drinks them, and I can't do it. I drink them like once every couple months, like with pizza, and it's okay. But cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that I drink them now as often as I do, which is not all that often, but I definitely like it enough. So
So let's see.
and
Good.
yeah, George is adding another clarification. The GraphQL is a plugin, yes, on top of like the core REST API that comes with a base WP installs. And the REST API has been around for years. I don't think many people have used it the way that we're using headless CMSs as much as they are now. So yeah, these soda waters are important topics. Definitely agree with you there.
Cool. So give it another second or two to bring some more questions in. But I want to say thanks again, James, for coming on and for talking about security in serverless, because it's something that I haven't known a whole lot about in what I've been doing. I'm sure I've got some exposed APIs out there.
Yeah, it's kind of like my whole thing was I was working on these demos and I was like creating a serverless function, which I thought was really cool. And then I was like, I have no way of preventing someone from like totally screwing me on this thing. And that's what like, I mean, relevant to my job, right? Because doing security stuff, but then also just like for these demos, I wanted to prevent someone from screwing me over.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and for people people in chat, if you don't have questions now, if you have comments or feedback, like I said, first time I've given this talk, felt like it went well, but I don't know what it's like on the other end, and especially for things that like are pretty tricky, like access tokens and JWTs and that sort of stuff. So if you have feedback, I would definitely love to hear it. So you can send me a message on Twitter at JamesQQuick or in Slack if we're in a Slack group, or email at me@jamesqquick.com.
Nice. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and say that is it for tonight. We're gonna leave the chat up for another 5-10 minutes, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn off cameras, turn off all that, start shutting things down, and hopefully we will do this again either in a couple weeks or in July, if nothing else, where I will be no longer in Memphis, but will be in the online world of web workers. So thanks again, James. Thanks for everyone for tuning. I know.
Yeah, those about you leaving, by the way.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time around.